to scale along. So it's kind of starts big and then shrinks down. I'm actually going to curve that as well. And when that's coming out of my hand, it should look okay. It should hide that effect reasonably nicely. I think 250 may have been too big. I'm going to go down to 100. So it's just in the core of it. There's now just a guaranteed flash in the very center of it. If you ever want to view this in slow motion, you can always hit it to 1%. And I can see what's happening here as it explodes out. 1% may have been, let's go 10. So that core is definitely going to be bright enough as it's jerking back, basically. So we've gone to there, and that's all set up. We know this works. And so that's my fire effect. So in my magic montage, I'm now going to go to here. And I'm going to play the montage at this exact point. So scroll down, go notifies, I'm going to right click, add notify, add particle effects. And the particle effect I'm going to be adding is the P_fire. And it's going to ask me for a socket name. So I know I can actually just add it to the sword socket. So at the moment that socket is actually rotated differently to how I thought it was. Currently that's actually shooting out down that axis. So I want that facing, it looks like it needs to be rotated down. We can check really quickly here actually. So if I go show, we can set this up to show us the sockets, and I can see which way that's facing at the time. So it's actually facing the blue, which means the Z axis. So I'm going to set this up to be on the blue axis. So under sphere, I want it to be enabled. I don't want it on the Z. Go back to the montage, zoom out. Our overall effect might be pretty big as well, so I'm going to tinker with that. So the overall effect means that we're going to get the sphere, and I'm going to set its initial distribution to be between 10 and 40, which gets us that much tighter cell. And you can see now that when we play it, you don't notice the hands pop back. From up here as well, there's like a hot flash. But when that's combined with the actual explosion, I think it'll look quite nice. So that'll have the particle kind of shooting out from that point. Other thing I'm going to do is a very brief charge up effect. So I'm going to do that by, again, going to my flight component. And the reason I'm basing these all off of that initial one is it just makes it a lot easier to keep things consistent. So I'm just going to call it P charge. And for this effect, it's going to have a duration of from this to this, so that's at 0.5 seconds. Yeah, so we're going to kill it at 0.5. Actually, I'm going to kill it even earlier than that, so I'm going to set the required duration. There it is, 0.25, so it's just going to be a quick effect, one time. So see how the rate plays until it's finished. So while we're charging up, we're going to have a rate that's doing that. But what I'm actually going to do is I'm going to set the point gravity to be offset on the Z-axis by about 250 units. So as I'm charging up my attack, that'll come out of my feet doing that, which I think looks quite nice. I could potentially make this go for a little bit longer, up to 0.5. 0.4 maybe. And I'm actually going to decrease the number of particles because I want it to look kind of cool but not be too excessive. Final thing that could look good here is adding an orbit to make them kind of swirl around their locations, which kind of creates a little bit more chaos. So I'm just going to have a quick look at how that goes. So the second we start to charge the effects, I'm going to play a notify. So add notify particle effects. I'm going to select it, and I'm going to set this to be charge. So that kind of works. I do need to end it quicker, so just in required, I'm going to set the duration to be 0.25, so it's, and I'm going to set the lifetime to be shorter than that, so it's kind of this effect, they all burst up. Because of that, actually, I could turn this up a bit and we'll get that initial cast. I'm also going to get the sphere and just pull that in a whole lot, so between 20 and 80 when we do it, 20 and 50 even. Yeah, that looks good. Great. Save. And the final thing that I'm going to do is when we actually shoot the projectile, it's at this point just here, right? So I'm going to add a notify. And before, you know how we had deal damage from sword? I'm now going to have fire magic ball. I'm going to drag this to the correct timing. I think about that's okay. Now, because we've done that, in the same way as before, where we set up the animation to deal damage to in the sword, I'm now going to open up my knight's animation blueprint. And within my animation blueprint, at the moment we have anim notify. This goes through the motions and then does try deal damage. And what we're going to do is we're going to fire magic ball is going to call a cast to the pawn owner. At which point that is then going to have a function that is going to be called launch projectile. So I'm going to quickly rework how our current magic setup is in the blueprint. So open up your character base. Now at the moment, try magic spawns the projectile directly. Now what I'm going to do instead is I'm going to make a new custom event that is called launch magic projectile. And the reason I'm doing it this way is that this is now going to play the montage that is going to be magic shoot montage. So that will play the montage, which will then fire this, because in this we're going to tell it to launch magic projectile. Now, at the moment, it's not compiling because I didn't compile the character first. It's a bit of a mismatch. It happens sometimes. If I compile it again, everything will be fine. So with that in mind, try magic will still get called with right click. That's going to play our montage. And montage is going to hit a point in it that says fire the bullet. And that's going to then come out here and spawn the projectile. Right click. See that? We've now got a great charge up effect, an impulse, and we have a good little animation to go with it. And as well as that, you can't actually spam it because the animation has to charge up. So as I do this, we're all set. Fantastic. So the last thing that I really need to do here is I'm going to actually add a little touch that on destroy, so on destroy in my projectile, I'm going to go to here, just going to say on destroyed, spawn the emitter at location, do what you're doing, but as well as that, can you do one other thing? Can you damage from a radial position? So, oh, sorry, we want to cause radial damage. Apply radial damage. There it is. So we can actually tell this to have a radius around it. And the reason I'm doing this is that while we're kind of safe from being hit by our own projectiles right now, I do think that when they explode, it would be good if we kind of dealt some damage around them, with the location being the actor location. And if I look up here, I can see what we have before. We've got the instigator, controller, damage causer. So, oops, sorry, those two are switched around. That's that, and self is that. Great. So that will simply cast out, do some damage to anyone that's nearby whenever they explode as well. And we're all set on that front. Now, if we wanted to make it so that they could hit the player, all we would need to do is the first time they end overlap with the player, we now no longer ignore the player. So at the moment, I'm doing this check that was if it's the player, I could actually have a separate check that goes into that, because we have actor begin overlap, but we also have actor end overlap. And because they spawn overlapping us, when they end overlap, we could then no longer do this condition if we wanted to. Not going to bother because I like how it is in this end. I just want you to be aware that it is a setup. But otherwise, that's all we really needed to do to kind of finish off the magic feature so that it was a bit nicer. The final little touch that we might want to consider doing, we could potentially charge up the projectile before throwing it, but I think this is a good enough example for the time being. So stick around and we'll get more enemies coming our way and we'll set the actual arena up. So we have our basic gameplay together now. It's time to actually get a proper game loop running. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to set up a spawner that's going to have enemies popping into the game and we'll be going from there. So initially this is just going to be spawning enemies in, making sure it works, and then we're going to move on to wave spawners. So to do this, I'm going to open up my game mode. And now if it comes into this, great. If it doesn't, you may need to click on the Open Full Blueprint Editor button. Now when it pops in, what I'm going to do is I'm going to drag off of this, and after the game begins, I'm going to set a timer. And I'm going to set a timer by event. And this event is going to be rather simple. All we're going to do is I'm going to drag off of that and I'm going to add a custom event. And the custom event is going to be called spawn enemy. Okay, now to spawn an enemy, what I'm going to be doing is get all actors of class. So I'm going to find every single location that we currently have a player start. And then from all of those player starts, I'm going to get it. I'm going to get the last index. No, sorry, I want to get. And what I actually want to get is the length. Now I'm not getting last index because random, when told to go between a number, actually selects a number between random length minus 1. So what I mean by that is if I get length, and I get a random integer, this looks for a random number between 0 and max minus 1. Now the length of the array is the number of things in it, and the last index in the array is the length minus 1. So I can use this, connect this to here, and tell it to get that, and that will now get me a reference to that player start. Once I've done that, all I need to do is spawn AI from class, and I want to get the location and rotation from the player start. Finally, I'm going to tell the actor class that we're spawning to be the character that I created. And I'm going to tell it to loop every 5 seconds. Loop, compile, save. Now, for the time being, we currently only have one player start in there. But you know what? That's actually okay. And the reason that that's okay is I can see if this is working or not very quickly. So it's okay for me to have that kind of setup. And you'll notice that as they pop in, the character immediately started chasing after me, which is great. A couple of seconds later. Now, we're noticing a bit of a flaw in our AI, which is that it takes 5 seconds for them to do anything because we wait 5 seconds before calling process AI for the first time. However, we have got ourselves with the basics of a gameplay. So if I look at this and I get the player start and I alt drag it around the map, I can just hit end to lower it to the ground to make sure it's okay. Alt drag up to here. Alt drag over to here. We can now have, when I hit play, every 5 seconds, so one spawned there. And if I run around, oh, another one had spawned over there. We've got ourselves a basic game. So, that's the basics of our initial gameplay. However, quite often you want to do things such as creating spawners. So what I'm going to do in this situation is I'm going to show you how to create a wave spawner, which means we spawn units in a group, and then when they're all finished off, we then spawn another, most likely bigger and deadlier group. Now, when it comes to creating spawning systems in Unreal, there's a couple of different approaches that we can take. Now, to begin with, I'm going to put this in the game mode, but I want you to be aware that all of the logic that we're doing here could theoretically just be an actor in the world. And the reason that you might want to do it as an actor in the world rather than in the game mode is that if it were an actor in the world, it would be interchangeable between levels. Since we only have the one level, and this is the entire game, I'm going to build it into the game mode, but I just want you to be aware of the potential structure that you could pursue. So what we're going to be doing is we're going to set this up. At the moment, we're doing the basic logic of finding a player start to spawn someone, but we don't actually have any really intelligent system here to dictate groups of enemies so that it'll spawn 5, and then it might spawn 2, and then 10, in some intelligent preset manner. So how we go about doing that means that we have to set this up such that we're focusing on waves and an ongoing queue. So I'm going to first off create a wave. Now, a wave is going to be a struct that holds an array of queues. So how that functions is I'm going to right click and I'm going to create a new blueprint struct. And I'm just going to call this wave structs. Now, the reason I've gone and done this is I want to have an array that holds an array of classes. So I'll show you how this works. If I open up my wave struct and I create a new variable that's just going to be called class to spawn, and this is going to be a reference of the knight characters, so character base, and it's going to be an array of them, but I don't want this to be a list of references to knight character bases. I'm going to click on this little arrow, well, highlight the arrow, and select class instead. Now this means that I'm holding a list of references of classes that we're going to be spawning in the world. Now, by setting this up as an array, if I were to go to my game mode and create a new variable, and this was the waves list, and I set this to be the struct that I just created called wave struct, I'm now able to create an array, compile, an array that if I was to add an element, I would then be able to create lists within lists. So this is a list of lists. So there's a list of things to then spawn. Now, in this situation, what I'm going to be doing is I'm going to set up this none to be a KG character base. And if I want to, I can duplicate this a few times. Now, what this is going to mean is that in my first wave, wave index 0, I'm going to be spawning 4 enemies. And then afterwards, if I was to add a new setup, I would then go ahead and spawn perhaps 3 enemies the next time. So this way I can actually create groups of these together. And there are some definite advantages to doing it this way, because if I have it set up like this, I'm able to pre-organize where a boss fight might be, I'm able to pre-organize where the more difficult enemies start to come in, etc. So this setup is quite good. Now, we've got our initial variable for waves, but I'm going to be basically getting the waves and I'm going to be pushing them off into a current queue. And this current event that we have, that is the spawner, it's currently processing it every 5 seconds, but I'm going to lower this down to every 1 second. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to set this up such that we have a start new wave function. And every time, I'm just going to move tick down a bit, every time we call the start new wave function, which is going to be a custom event, so I'm going to make start new wave. Let's go through the logic of what we want to have happen every time we run a new wave. To begin with, we want to have a current wave index. So I'm going to call this wave index. And I'm going to set this to be an integer. Now, what we're going to be doing is every time we start a new wave, we're going to get the wave index, we're going to increment it, at which point we're going to then get the current wave that we're up to. So I'm going to go, I'm going to get the waves, and I'm going to call get, and the wave that we want to currently access is the current wave index. If I, there we go, split the struct, we now have the class to spawn. I'm now going to right click on this and promote it to a variable because I want this to be my current queue. So we're going to get the current queue every time we start a new wave and load it into a new variable for us, at which point I think it's a good idea to shuffle the queue. And the reason I'm shuffling it is that we always have a list of enemies that we want to spawn, but I think it's still a good idea that within this wave we randomize what order they pop out. It's not essential, but I think it's a nice little touch. So now that we've done that, what we're going to do is we're going to handle the actual processing of the queue. Now currently how we're functioning is when we go to spawn the enemy, we're just straight up spawning a new enemy every time. So let's put some logic in there that kind of blocks that off a bit. What we're going to do is when we call spawn enemy, we're going to branch. And the reason we're doing a branch is if the current queue is greater, so if the length is going to be greater than 0, so if there's still things left in the queue to spawn, then we want to get all actors of class and run through our spawn. And over here where it says pawn class to select, what I'm actually going to do instead is I'm going to tell it to spawn the current queue 0. Now the reason I'm getting the current queue 0 is we're going to get this, and then immediately after spawning it, I'm going to then remove it from the list. So I'm going to get queue, and I'm going to call remove index, and I'm just going to remove index 0, which means that the one that was previously 1 will now be 0. So we've removed that index, at which point we want to actually set this up so that we have some sort of logic that tells us when to skip to the next wave. So how do we do that? How we do that is we create a custom event, and this is actually, instead of creating it this way, I know that this event is going to be triggered by the destruction of this actor. So a nice way to go about creating the event is to drag off of the reference to the enemy that we just spawned, type in onDestroyed, and you'll see that we have bind event to onDestroyed. I'm going to get that, plug it into remove index. I'm going to drag off of event, and I'm going to type in custom, and this is going to be check wave complete. And what this means we're going to be doing is we're going to check if the wave is actually over. So whenever an enemy dies, it's going to call this event. And this event is going to say, well, first off, let's see if there's anyone left in the queue. So first off, let's double check that we've actually spawned everyone. So is the length of this, if this is equal to 0, so if this is equal to 0, we're then going to go, okay, so we know that's empty. Let's go ahead and see if there are enemies left in the map. Now, it may seem logical for you to go off and check to see all of the enemies by checking the number of pawns, right? Problem is that actually includes us. So what I'm going to do instead is I'm going to do a get all actors of class, and I'm going to get all of the AI controllers. So I'm going to get specifically all of the KG AI controller base, because I know these are only the enemies. Now after I've done that, what I'm going to do is I'm going to find the length of this, and if the length is equal to 0, that means there are no enemies left in the map. And if there are no enemies left in the map, we can then attach this to here and simply call start new wave, which is the function that we had already created. So if that's equal to 0, if there's no enemies left to spawn and there's no enemies currently in the map, let's just start a new wave. So if I go over here, I can see that we're almost good, except I'm missing one reasonably important thing. And what that is I haven't actually told the game to begin just yet. And what I want to do is have a custom event that is for on begin play. What we're going to do is we're going to call reset game. And when we call reset game, we're going to set the wave index to 0, at which point we're then going to just go straight into this set queue. Now, if we don't do this and we just called start new wave from the very beginning of the game, wave index 0 would get skipped because we increment before loading it into the queue. So I've done that, I've popped that in. What I'm going to do now is I'm just going to call reset game, which is the function that we made, and I'm going to quickly set up a couple of waves. So at the moment we should get initially 1 enemy spawning, and then after that enemy's died we should get 3 enemies spawning, and then finally I'm going to add a third one into the mix, and when that's done I'm going to have 2, 3, let's get 4 enemies spawning. Compile save, let's hit play. Now, oh, I should also make sure that there's no enemies. There you go. I'm just going to remove this one from the map. Fantastic. So there's currently no enemies in. This one's just spawned, so we know that first section's working. They're down for the count. They're out. So that worked. Now, in a situation like this, it's a good idea to try and test your features in isolation. And a nice way to do that is to get the player stats and just kind of cluster them all together. Because this means that I'm actually going to see every single enemy spawn. Now, obviously you don't want to ship with this, but it's a good way to just quickly test that everything's working. So I'm going to get all of these player stats and push them into the same area and just confirm that we're working. Play. So the first enemy spawned. And that's the next wave, so that was those next 3 that I had. Fantastic, and then the 4th wave should spawn in just a second because the new one's kicked in. Great. That proves that the function's set up, everything's good, and the only thing left for us really to do from here is to make sure that we're adding in some game events so that we can call whenever a new wave is beginning, we can alert the player, and as well as that, add in some basic game events for any time the game has completed, so we can say, you know, success, well done, it took you this long. And that's it. That's how we get a basic wave spawning system. So in the previous session we set up spawners and we told it to take a class as a parameter. Now the reason for that is that I didn't want to just have one type of enemy. So instead what I'm going to do is in this presentation I'm going to set it up so that we have an alternative knight. So I'm going to go to blueprints. And first off, I'm going to quickly add some additional functionality to my character. Now, at the moment, our character has purple hair, and we set this up so that we would have a way to differentiate between characters. What I'm going to do is I'm going to make an enemy type that has red hair that throws magic instead of using their melee weapon. So in my construction script for the knight, I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to get the mesh, and I'm going to drag off of this and do create dynamic material instance. And what we're going to be doing here is changing their hair color. Now at the moment this mesh has a material that we've set up which will have a parameter for her hair, because we already went and sorted that out earlier. So I'm just going to quickly check what the parameter name is. In my situation it's called hair color. So we've got that set up. What I'm going to do is close this down and I'm going to drag off of this and do set vector parameter. I'm going to set this value to be hair color, and I'm going to get this and promote it to a variable that is called hair color. And if I was to go to my viewport and hit compile, I can now see that the hair color of the mesh is equal to whatever the hair color value is right now in the blueprint. So if I change this around, we can now have different versions. So this is what we're going to use to differentiate between our different classes. It's simple, but it's effective. So by default, we're going to have this, which is kind of like let's go with like a lighter green, for instance. There we go, looks kind of elven. So I'm going to hit OK, compile and save. And what I'm going to do now is I'm going to make one other modification. In my AI controller, which is under blueprints, in my AI controller, at the moment I'm telling them to do a move to function, at which point they'll try a melee. Now what I'm going to do instead is make the acceptance radius I'll make the acceptance radius something that is taken from the pawn itself. And then what I'll do is I'll set, instead of try melee, it'll be use primary attack. So that way the enemies can choose whether they want to throw magic or if they want to try melee. So I'm going to go content browser and I'm quickly just going to set up in my character. There we go. So I'm going to make a new function, which is just called use primary attack. And by default, I'm just going to make this feed right through to try melee. So in theory, this functionality for your basic character will be exactly the same as it was. Now the other thing I'm going to set up is a variable that is going to be attack range. And I'm going to set this up as a float. And by default, I'm going to set this to be a value of 50. Compile. Now, last but not least, I'm going to go to my controller base, and I'm just going to set this up. So instead of try melee, it's going to be use primary attack. And over here, before we do the call to AI move to, instead of doing get controlled pawn, I'm now going to drag off of that and do a cast to KG character. I'm going to convert this to a pure cast so I can just get the variable out of it. And finally, I'm going to get the range that we created and plug that into my acceptance radius. And now, for me to make an alternative enemy, all I need to do is right-click on my character base and create a child blueprint class. And this is going to be called KG Character Mage. Now, our mage is going to have red hair. So for me to set that up, I can just go over here to the default properties. I'm going to set her up to have red hair. Should just go like yeah, there we go. So I've set her up to have red hair. Her attack range is going to be far greater. I'm going to set it to 400. Compile, save. And in my event graph, all I'm going to do here is in the primary attack. So when we call use primary attack, instead of doing the existing call, which is to melee, I'm going to call magic. So in theory, she'll go ahead and she'll try her magic attack instead when she's at range. And now, the final thing for me to do is in my game mode, I'm now able to go into any of these waves and set her up as someone that will spawn in the first round. And then I'll make the final round, round 3, bunch of mages, and I should be able to see her functionality working. So compile. Again, that's going to be me as a base character because I can see it's green. If I hit play, you can see that she's spawned with her red hair, at which point she's doing this. Now the thing that she's not doing right now is actually aiming her magic attacks, because her acceptance radius, is actually not currently telling her to do that. So all I'm going to do here is over here, before we call primary attack, one last little thing I'm going to do is I'm going to set the focal point. So I can actually call this set focal point. And this tells the player who to actually face. So we're just going to say before you do your attack, no matter what, set the focal point to be your target. And now if I hit play and I watch, there's my character. So she's spawned and she's now just immediately throwing fire at me. Whoa. So we now have a functioning mage that we can swap out to make the waves more interesting. So most of what we have in place has been supporting the game type, but one thing I'd like to do would be add health widgets. This way when we look at an enemy, we know what health they're on, and also, more importantly, we know what health we're on. So I'm going to go ahead and go to the content browser, I'm going to go to Blueprints, and I'm going to create a new widget. So if you scroll down to User Interface and go Widget Blueprint, and I'm going to call this just UI Health Bar. And from this health bar, I'm going to set this up to have a very basic rectangle that will act as our health bar. So here, I'm going to set this from being full screen to desired. I'm now going to add a progress bar to my hierarchy. And I'm going to set the size of this progress bar. First off, I'm going to actually have the anchor in the middle, so that's all nicely set. And I'm going to make sure that the sizing is something that feels appropriate for alignment 0.5, 0.5 I personally like to have, and then zero out your position again. I'm going to set this to be size, I'm going to have it reasonably long and thin, like this. Now, I'm going to go down and I'm going to set up some of these variables. So to get this right, I'm going to set the percent to 0.5. Now, percent isn't between 0 and 100, it's between 0 and 1. So 0.5 means 50%. So this is currently blue if they're going to have health and red if they don't. So I'm going to change those colors around to be something that's a bit more stereotypically video gamey. So we've now got green for health. And I'm also going to set under style, background image. I'm going to set the tint of that to control what the damaged health section is. So orange seems like a good match, that orangey red. Compile, save, and now it's time for us to set this up properly. Now, what's going to happen is widgets don't actually know what they belong to. They have no easy way of looking up the widget component. So what we have to do instead is we need to set it up so that we have a variable in place that stores the owning knight character that's going to be feeding it its health information. So to do that, what I'm going to do is create a custom event, and I'm going to call this set owning knight character. And when this gets called, it's going to need an input that is a knight character. So I'm just going to type in the word character and set it to a KG character base. And I'm just going to set this to, instead of new param, it can be called owning knight. Now, once we set this, what we're going to be doing is we're going to get the base health value. So when this first gets created, I'm going to assume that the health that it has here is its default health. And I'm going to promote that to a variable just called default health. Whoops. Not healthy, health. Now, once that's been set, I'm now also going to set this to a variable, which is going to be, actually let's just connect that to there. Okay. And I'm going to set this to be called owning knight. Oops. So we have owning knight setting the owning knight value and the default health value. From here, I'm just going to compile and save. And in my designer, I'm going to go to the progress bar, and I'm going to set the percent to be a bind. So here, I'm going to click, and I'm going to create a binding. Now, in creating a binding, what I'm going to do is set this to be the owning knight. I'm going to get their health, and I'm going to divide it by the default health. And what that means is if I have 50% health and it's going to 100, we should have a value that gets us a nice percentage. So that's plugged in. And I'm now going to do one final thing, which is go to my character base. And in the viewport, I'm going to add the component itself. So this is going to be a widget. I'm going to call this health bar. Now the health bar is going to be set up as the widget that we've created. So widget class is going to be the UI health bar. You can see that it's visible there. So I'm going to drag this to here, and I'm going to make it face upwards because we know that's the direction of the player. So just above the head's fine, I think. And then in my construction script, going to I've got the health bar and I want to get the widget, which is this, and I want to cast this to a health bar. So I'm going to look at my health bar, and then I'm going to call that setOwningNight function that we created, and set that to be a reference to myself. So we're getting the health bar, we're getting the, and we're setting it to say that, hey, we're the one that owns it. Compile, save, and now if I were to play the game, I'd see that I'm on full health right now. But if I was to run around the environment and find an enemy, when I hit them, they're now on half health. Hit them again, they're dead. And we now have a simple, functioning health bar on every single character in the game, including myself. And that's all it takes. So next up, I'm going to add the health pickup so that we can finish off the game stuff, at which point we'll move on to the final UI touches and we'll be done. So we've added health, but I feel like it's kind of unfair to make a survival game where you're only allowed to get hit twice. So what I think it would be good to do is add a setup for health pickups that are just spawning around the map. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to add a new blueprint class that's going to be based on an actor, and I'm going to call it KG Health Pickup. Now, we could make a base pickup class that we override to do other things, but since I know exactly what I want in this situation, I'm not going to do a base class. I'm just going to set this up as a health pickup. And for this, what I'm going to do is I'm going to have a sphere component, so sphere collision, that is going to be the root. Now that I've added that, I'm going to go through and set the radius to be quite large, about 100 centimeters. And I'm going to set the collision to be overlap only pawn, because the only thing that should be able to pick these up is the player. So now that we've done that, I'm now going to go and I'm going to cast this actor that it's overlapping to my character base. So if I open this up, we already know that we've got our health variable being stored here. So I'm going to drag off of other actor and type in KG character. And we now have cast a KG character base. Now what I'm going to do here is, before I apply the health, I'm actually just going to do a quick check. And I'm going to say, let's get their health. And let's check if their health is equal to their default health. This means that we don't give them the health pickup if they're already on full health. I need to get the class and then defaults. So on overlap, I'm going to check what the default is for this class, and if this is equal to the current health, we don't want to do anything. But if it's not equal to the current health, then we want to actually give them health. So to do that, what I'm going to do is, so if this is false, I'm going to set their health. So I'm going to say health is equal to the minimum between two things. If I get a reference to their health as well over here, I could drag off of this, but I'm just going to try and keep it neater. I'm going to pick the minimum between two things. Either I'm going to select their maximum health, or I'm going to select their current health plus the additional health that we're giving them. So it's either going to be equal to health plus, let's say that the health gives you 10 health. I'm going to type 10, but then I'm going to promote that to a variable called health offering. So health offering, and the minimum is also going to be set to the class default health. So it's going to pick one of those two options. And the reason being is that if the health plus the health offering is equal to, say, 120, but my max health is normally 100, it's actually going to choose 100 instead of 120. At which point, now that we've done that, I'm going to destroy myself. And that's all it takes for us to have a basic setup. Let's quickly put together a particle system. I think I'm going to base it on one of the existing particle systems to save time. So I'm going to get the current flight effect, which looks like this. And I'm going to set that up to be blue instead. So I'm going to duplicate the flight effects. And I'm going to call this p_health. Let's open that up. I'm going to set the color of a life to go from that light blue to instead a 20, 50, 100. So we end up with something more like that. I think looks quite nice. I'm also going to set the sphere to include the Z axis, so we get something that's a bit more like that. And to be honest, that's really all we need to do. If people see that, they're going to know it's good for you. So health pickup, I'm going to add particle system. So if I go to my viewport, we can now see that that's my health. I'm going to compile and save. And one of the great things about how we've set up our health system right now is that it should automatically actually go off and set everything else up. Our health should correctly reflect the change and everything because we're polling for it. So inside the map, I'm going to add some health pickups just as a quick test. Just drag a few of these around the world. Now, initially, I'm going to need someone to hurt me before I can actually pick it up. Because if I overrun them now... Oh! So, that shouldn't have let me pick it up. So it's time for us to go back through our logic and figure out what happened. At the moment, if my health is equal to... so this true should actually be if that is false. That's what it was. Save. So just then I accidentally made health that was only able to be collected when you're at full health. There we go. So now we're fine. Those are set up. I just need someone to hurt me so I can test it. Or I can hurt them. Okay, so now that I've been hurt, let's do a really quick test. If I pick up this, you can see that our health meter grew. Now that we have the health pickups in the game, let's let the AI actually collect them. So to do this, what I'm going to do is open up my AI controller base, and I'm going to move everything across just a bit in my process AI function. And I'm simply going to check one thing before I do anything else. And that is, before I process whether I should attack the target or wander, I'm actually going to have a diversionary diversionary function set up, so that what we're essentially going to be doing is checking the health of the player and seeing if they should be looking around for any pickups. So to do that, I'm going to go process AI, and I'm going to quickly get my controlled pawn. Cast to character base, and from here, if that fails, we just run through to the rest of it. Realistically, that should never fail, but that's okay. Just setting it up just in case. So if that is going through, I'm going to get my health, and I'm going to compare it with the class defaults. So I'm going to get the class. And I'm just going to check the class defaults. So I'm going to check my health against it. And if my health is less than the default health, then what we want to do, if that goes into there. So if it's less than, we're going to go off and quickly check around our surroundings for any health. Otherwise, I'm going to set this to false, and I'm going to instead look for the player. So if that's the case, I'm going to connect this. I'm going to bring that up a bit so it's a bit clearer. So if this is true, I'm going to do a sphere overlap actors check, same as before. Let's plug this in. And I'm going to get my controlled pawn, and I'm going to get its location, which is where I'm going to test my sphere from. So get actor location. Object types are going to be world dynamic. There's a nice function here that I can do get class filter and tell it to only look for health pickups. And if there was an overlap that passed the filter, this will return true, which means if it found any health, that'll come out true, which means we would go for that. But if this is false, we go to here. So if this is true, I'm then just going to do an AI move to, which is going to be my pawn. The destination is going to be just the 0 indexed one, so whatever is the first one that it finds. Acceptance radius is 20. And that means that our AI will now divert to looking for health if there's some health within 1,000 units of their location and they've been damaged. Okay, so let's test that out. Compile, save. First off, we need our AI to find us. There they are. There you go. So they ran off and they grabbed health instead. And because our health pickups are so low, they're actually prioritizing health at the moment. Now, that's all it took for us to get that essentially working. One thing I would like to do here though is test it in full so that they're actually getting full health from these health pickups. So I'm just going to up the value in the health pickup to be 50 instead, which should put them back at full health from a hit. So now that that's been bumped up, if I test this out and see if we have any enemies around us. So that she's seen me. Oh, whoops, probably shouldn't have killed her. Not the point of this project. So now they've been hit. I'm just going to do a very quick test and run them towards health. Another one over here. See how she diverted and grabbed the health instead? That's all it takes. You now got AI that actually seeks out actual health. Safe. So, that's it for the core fundamentals of how these things should be set up. The final thing is going to be setting it so that these health pickups spawn. So to do that, what I'm going to do is instead of having the health pickup, I'm going to create a health spawner that spawns health pickups. And every time those are destroyed, so every time they're collected, it waits a couple of seconds before creating a new one. So to do that, all I need to do is go to my content browser. I'm going to create a new blueprint class. It's going to be of type actor, and I'm going to call this spawner, not KG spawner. Now in KG spawner, what I'm going to do is set this so that on begin play, it's going to spawn actor from class. So it's going to create something, and it's going to create something at its location. So at its own transform. Now that I've done that, what I'm going to do is I'm going to say bind, so on destroyed. It's going to do this event, which is going to be an event that has a delay of, let's say, by default 5 seconds, at which point it's going to rerun this, which essentially means on destroyed, so it's going to spawn something, which we haven't set just yet. It's going to spawn something. Anytime that thing gets destroyed, it's going to wait 5 seconds before spawning it again. So I'm going to promote this to a variable and call it respawn wait, or delay actually. So we have respawn delay. Over here I'm going to bind this to a variable and I'm going to call this actor to spawn. I'm going to set both of these to be visible, and I'm going to set the defaults so that by default it is a health pickup, and the delay is already set to 5. So I'm just going to have this, I'm going to delete these health pickups now and instead add the item spawner that we've created. So I'm going to put one there and another one here. Now there's no item there yet. However, if I was to spawn in the world, you'll see that they're actually there now. And all I need to do is now wait for an enemy to come find me, and I can show you what it looks like when they're destroyed and they're recreated. Somewhere out there is an AI running in the exact opposite direction to me. Yep, there they are. So I've hit them once. Now they're going to chase me. And they collected their AI, and at the very end there you saw it respawning. So we know that that's working. And that's all it takes. You've now got a full respawning, cycling health system in the game. You can add these to wherever you want, and the variables are exposed so you can change how long it takes for them to respawn in certain areas. So there's only 3 things that we really need to do before this series is complete. The next one that we'll be doing is adding some pop-ups so that whenever we finish a wave, it says wave completed on screen. The one after that will be giving us a camera blend target so that when the game finishes, it'll pop out over there and we'll let your character kind of do a victory dance before restarting the game. And then finally, we'll be packaging it for distribution. So let's get on with that. Now, to do the content for the HUD, we're going to go to our content browser, blueprints, and I'm going to go down to user interface and create a new widget blueprint. And I'm going to call this UI HUD. Now within UI HUD, this is actually not going to have anything in this situation apart from the wave completed message. If you want to, you're more than welcome to bind it to actual in-game variables and set up a more complete project. But in this situation, all I want to do is add in text that is going to be anchored to the center of the screen. I'm going to make the alignment 0.5, 0.5, and set the positioning to 0, so we're dead in the center. I'm going to size to content and set this to around a font of about 60 or 70. I think 70 will do. And the text is just going to say wave completed in an excited way. So we've got wave completed, and I'm going to have this initially hidden. So I'm going to set the visibility to be hidden. Now, to have this pop up on screen, I'm simply going to add an animation, and this is going to be called wave completed pop-up anim. And for this, I'm going to first off name the wave completed to be wave comp text. I'm going to add this, and I'm going to add a visibility track as the first port of call. So initially, this is going to set it to visible, at which point at the end of the pop-up, which will be just 1 second long, I'll set it to hidden again. So we're visible and then hidden. As a quick touch, I'm going to add a track, and that's going to be a transform. I'm going to set the initial transform to have a scale of 1, which is the default. However, at the end, I'm also going to have it set to a scale of 1, so I'm just going to click the add scale, which will grab the default XY of 1. And over here, I'm going to add this again, add scale keyframe, which will add it to both channels. And the reason I'm doing this is so that we can do a really quick pop, which is around here, I'm going to set this value to 1.1, and I'm going to set this value also to 1.1, which means when we play it, it'll have a little bit of a pop when it comes on screen. Now that we've got our wave completed pop-up animation, I'm going to simply compile it, save it, and now I'm going to load the player controller. So within the player controller, we're going to have to add this to our viewport, and then when it's the right time, we'll play the animation itself. So on begin play, I'm going to tell it that I want to create a new widget, which would be our HUD. And it's just going to be UI HUD, which you can see here. So we're creating the widget, setting it to HUD, at which point I'm going to promote this to a variable because I want to store a reference to our HUD widget. So we now have a HUD widget stored. Now I'm going to add this to the viewport. And now the next step is going to require an additional event within our game mode. So I'm going to go Content Browser, Game Mode, and within here, whenever we spawn a new wave, so we call Start New Wave, I'm going to put in an event dispatcher here that lets anything else in the game know that it's time to create a new wave. So I'm going to add an event dispatcher that's called New Wave, drag this in, and I'm just going to call it at this time. Now the reason I'm doing this is that if I go to here, I can now get my game mode. I can check that it's the KG game mode. And assuming that it is, what we're going to do is we're going to bind to new wave. And make a custom event that is pop-up wave UI, which is simply going to call on the HUD widget, play animation, and it's going to look for an input animation. Now your first thought might be to click on here, but that's not how this actually works. We need to get a reference to it from the HUD widget. So I'm going to drag down and I'm just going to type in anim, and you'll see that we have get wave completed pop-up anim, which is the animation that I created. And now when I connect this to here, everything is sorted. So compile, save. I'm going to hit play now. And I'll just wait for an enemy to appear. So this first wave is only one person. Wave completed pops up, and the new wave spawns. And we're all set. That's all it took. So for our next section, we're going to be adding the final camera blend, at which point we'll add in the packaging settings, and that'll be all there is. So for this video, we're going to be doing the final gameplay change, which is going to be a simple section that will change the view target over to a camera that's within the world. And the reason we're doing this is that it's kind of nice to have the camera kind of looking at the rest of the scene with you in it and the player just playing a victory animation. So to do this, I'm going to go to my content browser and I'm going to open up my game mode. Now the reason I'm doing this is I want to set up a function so that when we increment waves, if we're actually over the final wave index, we no longer spawn a new wave, but instead what we do is we play the end game scenario. So I'm going to need an additional check, which is going to be just here. So I'm going to move these across. And this additional check is simply going to say, there we go. If the waves, if the last index is less than the current wave index, So if the last index is less than the wave index, that means that we've now gone beyond the scope of this array. So if that is false, we continue doing what we were doing. So if the last index is equal to or greater than the wave index, just keep doing what we're doing. However, if this is true, I'm going to create a custom event that is going to be called endgame. So if this is true, I'm just going to call endgame. Plug this in here, and I'll try and neaten this up just a little bit. And in the endgame function, I'm going to now have a binding set up to simply change the camera target on the character themselves. So to do this, I'm going to get my endgame function, and off of this, I'm going to get the current player controller. And now there's a nice little function here that I can do, which if I drag in, I can actually type in blend, and you'll see that we have set view target with blend. Now setting the view target with blend just looks for a new camera that you want to have as the view target, how long it takes to get there, and whether you want to lock the outgoing or not, which I strongly recommend. So I'm going to set the blend time to be 4 seconds. I'm going to lock the outgoing, which means if the camera that you're moving away from is shifting, it doesn't try and match up with that and try and be somewhere in between. Believe me when I say this is usually the safest option, is to lock the outgoing camera. Now the other thing that I'm going to want to do here is I need to actually give it something to look at. So what I would strongly recommend doing is adding a get all actors of class, and just looking for any camera in the game that we can adhere to. Now that we've got every camera in the game, I'm going to simply get a random one of these. So I'm going to get the length, and I'm going to type random, and then I'm going to get the random camera that's been selected, compile, and now within the map, if I want to, I can simply add in a camera actor from the modes panel. So I'm going to put a couple of these into the map at different locations. This one can be here. And now, if I were to play the game, I would jump all the way through to add the new waves. Now, the problem is that there's a lot of waves right now for me to test with, so I'm just going to delete all of my waves except the first, and save. And now if we test this out, when the game finishes, you'll see that we'll get a camera that will move over to wherever we chose for it to be. So the final thing there is simply going to be adding in on this. We want to tell the players to play an animation, and I'm just going to hook that up with a delegate. So once again, I'm going to get this and make an event dispatcher, and I'm going to call this endgame, endgame dispatch. I'm going to call this, compile, save, and from here, if I were to go to my my player classes, so I'm going to go to my content browser, I'm going to open up KG character base. Now from here, what I'm going to do is go to my event graph, and on begin play, I'm going to get the game mode. I'm going to cast to our game mode. I'm going to bind to the end game dispatcher that we created. I'm going to create a custom event off of this that's just going to be called endgame dance. And this is going to be a montage. So I'm going to go to my content browser, assets, night, and you see that we have an animation called victory, which currently looks like this. So it's just a victory dance up and down. So I know this goes for quite a while. It's 5 seconds worth. So I'm going to set this to be a quick simple montage that I'll play on the character. So in my content browser, I'm going to right click, create anim montage. I'm happy to leave it as being called victory montage. So from in here, I'm going to go to my character base, and my endgame dance is simply going to be set this up to play montage. The montage is going to be the victory montage. And this means that every player that's currently alive when this goes off will be there. The other thing that I'm going to do, just in case, is disable movement. So that will now disable the movement and then play the anim montage. So that's our standard endgame dance, and this means that when we die, if we call endgame, it's actually going to do it for both teams. So I've got that in there. What I'm going to do is go to my game mode, and since that's all being called, this will currently work, but I do want to have a quick thing in there so that if the player ever dies, that I've set it up to be playing endgame for them as well. So what we need to do here is we're going to go to our character base, and we're going to create a simple extra piece of functionality that is going to see if when someone dies, if that person dying is the player. If that is the player, it's going to report back to the game mode, endgame. So in character base, I'm going to go to here, and just before I destroy everything, in fact, I'm going to do it before the delay, that way as we die we'll move away and we'll see the player on the ground. I'm going to do a branch, which is going to be simply getting the controller, and I'm going to check if the controller that we're getting is a player controller, and if it is a player controller, so if that's true, we're going to do an extra thing. If it's false, we'll do what we've always done. But if it's true, I'm going to call endgame on the game mode. So I need to get a reference to the game mode. Since we can't get up to this without having done the earlier cast, I'm simply going to do a pure cast. Cast to KG game mode, convert to pure. And from here, I'm simply going to say, if this is going to there, we're going to call endgame. Compile, save. So if it is a player, we'll do that. And then in my game mode, after I've done this set target with blend, I'm going to have a delay that is 6 seconds, at which point, for the time being, I'm happy to actually just I'm happy to restart the level itself. So just reload everything. To do that, the quickest way is actually going to be for me to execute console command. So I'm going to do that, and I'm just going to type in restart level. Now in a standard game, what you would want to do is to actually go ahead and load up a menu, you know, like a death menu, and then let them select whether they want to restart or what you want to do. But this will suffice for the time being. So if we play this, we've only got one person in there at the moment, so if I find them, let them beat me. So that did fall over, however it looks like it wasn't actually playing our animation. So the reason that didn't work was because I forgot one extra check, which was in my character base. I want to make sure that when we call disable movement and endgame dance, that I only do that on living players. You don't want your bodies getting up and dancing. So if the health is greater than 0, so if that's true, compile, save. So we're almost there. Most of this is functional. The only thing that we need to do now is also set in the anim montage this to the full body slot. So I'm going to save that now. And from here, we should now have a fully functional build that if I die or if the other player dies, it's going to restart the level, and we'll have all of the basic animation support in there. So there I am. I died. She jumped in the air. and that restarted. So now if I run around, she should be here again. I accidentally left an additional camera actor over there. We'll see her eventually. There we go. So before she died, this time I'll win. So that's it. That's all we needed for the main project. The next thing will be packaging it, and then we'll be done. So this is the last video of this series. What you are going to be doing here is going through and actually creating a packaged build. So this is the kind of build that you could actually send to a friend and have them testing the game. So I'm going to go to File, Package Project, and you'll see that we have windows. Now I could just select this and set things up, but I'd rather first time go to Package Settings, and we'll get this menu here. Now there's a couple of things to take note of. Some of these are a bit more in depth than what we really need to cover here, such as the HTTP packaging settings. But for the time being, the ones that I recommend you being aware of are build configuration, which allows me to select either development or shipping. Now these two are very similar, however there are some important differences between the two. So in a shipping build, it removes the console from the game, and it removes all stats and profiling stuff as well under the hood. So shipping build's actually going to run better, but you won't necessarily have access to everything that you typically would in the development build. But for the most part, during development, you're going to just be doing development builds. That said, I do recommend every now and then doing a shipping build, just in case, to make sure that nothing is somehow broken in that area. Now, the other settings that are worth noting are your staging directory, which is just where the content's going to get copied to. In this situation, I'm just going to make a section under Udemy, which is going to be in demos, and I'm just going to make a new folder called package. So that'll go to there. Now, you've got a full rebuild. By default, it's off. It's up to you as whether you want it enabled or disabled. It's just the difference between doing an iterative build or not. Sometimes that can cause issues, but I often find it's okay to not do a full rebuild. That said, if you're doing a build, you're going to be sitting down and going for the long haul anyway, and cooking out all the files. So it is probably best practice to actually keep this enabled for the most part, especially if you're doing something like using a build server that's going to be running overnight. Now, here we have nativization of blueprint assets. In 4.14, this is experimental, but from 1.5 and onwards, this is no longer considered an experimental feature. This will convert down all of your blueprint assets to C++, which will make them more efficient. It's up to you whether you want to check this. I strongly recommend, since it's out of experimental from 1.5 onwards, to actually keep this checked, but that's up to you. Now from here, we've got only two other things that we really need to make note of. Both are reasonably important. First is if I click here, I can scroll down and you can see we've got some additional options for what we're cooking and what we're not cooking. Now in this situation, I'm going to go ahead and tell it list of maps to include in a packaged build. If I click this, I can now browse for any maps that I want to have included. So I'm going to make sure that my survival map is included. I'm then going to go up to maps and modes, and I'm going to ensure that the game default map is set to my survival map. So that means that when the game first launches, it'll go straight into that. Now from here, I'm going to go and change one last thing. I'm going to go to my content browser, and I'm going to open up the game mode. Now the reason I'm doing this is at the moment we can have a really boring game if we just launch in with one mage. So I'm going to set up some waves. I'm just going to set up the first one to be character base. In fact, I might make quite a few character bases in that first round. I'm then going to add another wave, and again I'm going to have a couple of character bases, and then we're going to have the mages come in towards the end. So put you in. Finally, for the last one, I'm going to add a wave and then have a couple of mages here. I'm going to compile and save, and now I'm just going to push this build out. Windows 64. It's already set up because of the directory from staging, so I'm just going to click OK. Now I'm just going to wait for that to finish. And it shouldn't take too long. So now that it's done, I'm going to open up the directory, which has the build inside of it. And that directory is just in packaged. I've got Windows no editor. So I'm going to launch the game up. And the game's loaded up. And you can see if I run around, everything's totally working. We've got our bad guys, throw magic at them, and we're all good. Simple little game. So that's it. That's our project completed. For your continuation, I highly recommend going through, make sure you add some effects and sound effects, but everything that you need to really polish this up, you've been taught.